Okay, let's unpack this. We often talk about protein intake as, the cornerstone of a healthy diet. But what happens biochemically when the building blocks of those proteins, the amino acids, are just not there?
The clinical consequences are, well, they're immediate and they're profound. Our source material, Harper's Biochemistry, really sets the stage by highlighting nutritional deficiencies like kwashiorkor.
That's where you have enough calories, but not enough protein.
Exactly. Or marasmus, which is a deficiency in both. These conditions are just a powerful reminder that the basic machinery of human life really depends on having a steady supply of all 20 amino acids.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to do a deep dive into the biochemistry of the 12 amino acids the human body can actually make for itself. We're translating Chapter 27 to understand the pathways, the regulation, and the crucial clinical implications of what we call the nutritionally non-essential amino acids.
And it's so important to clarify that terminology right away. It's a bit misleading. When we say non-essential, we don't mean optional for your health. Not at all. All 20 are absolutely essential for life. The distinction is purely nutritional.
Right. 8 amino acids are nutritionally essential. You must get them from your diet. But 12, we can build ourselves.
Okay.
And the central puzzle here is why. Why did evolution let us lose the pathways for some, but keep them for others?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to metabolic cost, the amino acids that are nutritionally essential. In other organisms, making them requires these long, really complex metabolic pathways.
How long are we talking?
Oh, often 6 to 10 enzymes, just to make one molecule. It's a huge investment.
Whereas the 12 we kept are, I guess, metabolically easy.
That's the perfect word for it. They typically need just 1 to 3 steps. The evolutionary calculus is just brilliant, really.
Really?
Maintaining the genetic code to synthesize those complex amino acids is a huge drain on ATP and nutrients. It's negative survival value.
So we just kept the quick, simple paths and decided to get the tough ones from our food.
Which brings us to the raw materials. These simple syntheses begin with really common molecules, things found at the heart of our metabolism. Biochemists call them amphibolic intermediates.
Amphibolic, meaning they can go both ways. Catabolism and anabolism.
Precisely. They can be broken down for energy or used to build things up. For amino acids, we're primarily looking at alpha-ketoglutarate, which comes out of the citric acid cycle,
Okay.
and then 3-phosphoglycerate and pyruvate, which are both produced during glycolysis.
Let's start with the biggest group then, the one derived from alpha-ketoglutarate. That's the precursor for glutamate, which then sort of feeds into several others.
Glutamate synthesis is that first critical step. It happens inside the mitochondria, catalyzed by an enzyme called glutamate dehydrogenase. The reaction itself is a reductive amidation.
So we're adding an amino group, the amidation part, and reducing the molecule at the same time.
Exactly. And the physiological consequence of this is huge.
How so?
The reaction strongly, and I mean strongly, favors the formation of glutamate, which means it's constantly pulling cytotoxic ammonium ion out of the system.
So it's a detoxification step?
It's detoxification and synthesis, all rolled into one beautiful reaction. It safely incorporates that toxic ammonium into a useful amino acid.
And once we have that crucial glutamate molecule, the next step is often glutamine, right? Which I think of as the body's main nitrogen shuttle.
That's a great way to think of it. Glutamine is formed from glutamate using glutamine synthetase. This requires ATP, and it goes through this high-energy intermediate called gamma-glutamyl phosphate.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is the ordered binding. Glutamate and ATP have to bind first. They form that intermediate, which primes the molecule for attack.
And then the ammonium comes in.
Then the ammonium ion comes in, attacks the intermediate, kicks out a phosphate, and you're left with glutamine.
So the energy from ATP makes a temporary super reactive intermediate to make sure the reaction actually goes. Now, what about alanine and aspartate? My understanding is they don't need this kind of complex multi-step process.
No, they're much, much simpler. Alanine and aspartate are formed directly through a process called transamination.
Which is basically a nitrogen swap.
It's a rapid nitrogen swap. You take the carbon skeleton of pyruvate, transfer an amino group onto it, and you get alanine. You do the same thing to oxaloacetate, and you get aspartate. Simple as that.
So if we just take a step back for a second, we've mentioned 3 enzymes: glutamate dehydrogenase, glutamine synthetase, and the aminotransferases. Are you saying those 3 are responsible for converting all the inorganic nitrogen in our system into the amino nitrogen we need for every single amino acid?
That is the essential takeaway, yes.
Yeah.
They are the core managers of our entire nitrogen economy. They take what's potentially toxic ammonium and turn it into the fundamental building blocks of life.
Incredible. Okay, let's move to the second major family, the one that stems from glycolytic intermediates. We can start with asparagine, which is built right off of aspartate.
Right. And asparagine synthesis, which is catalyzed by asparagine synthetase, will sound very familiar. It looks a lot like glutamine synthesis.
So there's another phosphate intermediate.
There is an aspartyl phosphate intermediate. But the key difference, at least in human tissues, is the nitrogen source. In humans, it's typically glutamine that donates the nitrogen, not free ammonium ion.
And I see another high-energy driver here. How do we make sure this reaction goes forward? What's the thermodynamic trick this time?
The reaction is very strongly favored because it's coupled with the hydrolysis of PPI, that's pyrophosphate, into two separate molecules of inorganic phosphate.
Oh, breaking that bond.
Breaking that pyrophosphate bond releases a massive amount of free energy. It effectively pulls the entire reaction forward, making the synthesis highly efficient.
It's like a guarantee from the cell that asparagine will be made when needed. Okay, next up is serine. Let's trace that one back to 3-phosphoglycerate from glycolysis.
The synthesis of serine is a really neat three-step linear path. First, 3-phosphoglycerate is oxidized to 3-phosphohydroxypyruvate,
creating a keto acid.
Right. That keto acid then undergoes transamination, another one of those nitrogen swaps, and that's followed by a simple dephosphorylation step to remove the phosphate group. And there you have it, serine.
Serine is important on its own, but it's also a major precursor for glycine. And glycine has this reputation for being made in, well, a lot of different ways.
It does. Our source lists three main routes. We can use aminotransferases on a molecule called glyoxylate, which favors glycine synthesis. There's also a complex breakdown pathway starting from choline.
A bit more obscure.
A bit more obscure, but it contributes to the overall pool. But the most important route, and it's often reversible, is the interconversion between serine and glycine.
Okay, tell me about that one.
This is catalyzed by serine hydroxymethyltransferase. And what's really important here is the cofactor it uses, tetrahydrofolate or H4 folate.
Which comes from the B vitamin, folic acid?
Correct. So this reaction isn't just about making glycine. It's a crucial way the body manages and transfers single carbon units around, using that H4 folate as the carrier.
We've covered a lot of these linear pathways, but now let's look at proline. It starts with glutamate, but it ends up with that unique ring structure.
Proline synthesis is just elegant. It's a three-step process, starting with glutamate. First, you form glutamate gamma phosphate, which is then reduced to glutamate gamma semialdehyde.
And this is where it gets really cool for anyone trying to visualize this, that semialdehyde is incredibly reactive.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that this intermediate spontaneously cyclizes. It doesn't need a dedicated enzyme to close the ring.
It just does it on its own.
It just naturally reacts with itself to form the internal ring, 1-pyrroline 5-carboxylate. Then a final enzyme comes in for the last reduction step to yield L-proline. That spontaneous step is amazing. It saves the cell an entire enzyme.
That's the efficiency of these short pathways right there. The inherent design of the molecule does the work.
Okay, let's transition to a group that seems to break the rules a bit. Non-essential amino acids that still depend completely on nutritionally essential ones. Let's start with cysteine. Cysteine is the perfect paradox, isn't it? Your body can make it so you don't need to eat it directly. But if you don't eat enough methionine, you can't make any cysteine.
So it's completely dependent on an essential amino acid. Tell us about that pathway.
It's a bit complex. Methionine is first converted into a molecule called homocysteine. This homocysteine then partners up with the non-essential amino acid, serine, to form a bigger molecule called cysteine.
Okay, so it's a merger.
It's a merger.
Okay.
And then finally, that cysteine is hydrolyzed. It's split apart to yield cysteine and a byproduct, homoserine.
So cysteine is like a molecular hybrid. It's borrowing pieces from two different parents.
That is the perfect analogy. The sulfur atom in cysteine, which is so key to its function, comes from the essential methionine. But the carbon backbone, that's derived from the non-essential serine. It's a brilliant way to recycle essential components.
And the other major player in this category is tyrosine, which depends entirely on phenylalanine.
Correct. Tyrosine is formed from the essential amino acid phenylalanine, and the enzyme is phenylalanine hydroxylase. This is a clinically vital reaction, and it's irreversible.
Meaning you can't go backwards.
You can't. So if you have enough tyrosine in your diet, it can spare some phenylalanine. But dietary tyrosine can never fully replace the need for phenylalanine because the reaction only goes one way.
And phenylalanine hydroxylase is a specific type of enzyme, a mixed function oxidase. Can you break down what that means?
It's a beautifully choreographed system. A mixed-function oxidase takes a molecule of oxygen, O2, and it uses it in two different ways.
Okay.
It incorporates one atom of that oxygen directly onto phenylalanine to create the hydroxyl group, making it tyrosine. And at the same time, it reduces the other oxygen atom to water.
And it needs power for that reduction.
It does. The power is supplied by a cofactor called tetrahydrobiopterin, which itself gets regenerated using NADPH. It's a very precise, high-level chemical transformation.
That whole process just illustrates how these non-essential amino acids are either made simply from central hubs, or if they're more chemically unique, they just piggyback on existing essential amino acids.
Exactly. It shows you the economic choices the body has made over evolutionary time.
Now for our final section. Modifications that happen after the protein is already built, post-translational modifications. We're talking about hydroxyproline and hydroxylysine, which are critical for collagen.
The most crucial point for you to remember here is that there is no specialized tRNA for either of these.
So you can't just plug them in during translation.
You can't. They have to be created post-translationally after the proline and lysine residues are already woven into that peptide chain.
And this hydroxylation process requires a surprisingly complicated cast of characters, including a very famous vitamin.
It does. The enzymes proline and lysyl hydroxylase are also mixed-function oxidases. They need several cofactors to work. The peptide itself, molecular oxygen, alpha-ketoglutarate, iron in the Fe2+ state, and, critically, ascorbate.
Or vitamin C.
Vitamin C. And this is where the clinical rubber really meets the biochemical road. A deficiency in vitamin C leads directly to scurvy.
And now we know the exact biochemical reason why.
We do. When vitamin C is absent, these hydroxylation reactions fail. And those hydroxyl groups are essential for forming the stable crosslinks that give collagen its immense strength. Without them, the collagen helix is unstable.
And that instability shows up physically.
It manifests as the classic symptoms of scurvy. Impaired wound healing, bleeding gums, joint pain. It's the physical breakdown of connective tissue throughout the entire body.
It's just amazing to think that one vitamin is the linchpin for our entire physical structure.
And if you thought that was ingenious, well, the body has a whole other level of sophistication, which brings us to the 21st amino acid, selenocysteine, or SECR.
The 21st amino acid, why is it so special?
It's absolutely essential for at least 25 human selenoproteins. These are mostly enzymes like glutathione peroxidase that manage critical redox reactions. If you replace this special selenium-containing residue with a standard cysteine, the enzyme's catalytic activity just tanks.
So there are clinical consequences to a deficiency.
Oh, absolutely. Impairments in these selenoproteins are implicated in everything from tumor genesis to a serious cardiomyopathy called Keyshawn disease.
So how does the cell manage to insert this unique, highly active residue? It can't be post-translational, can it? The active site has to be right from the start.
You're right, it's not. It's an incredibly sophisticated mechanism called co-translational insertion. It's inserted during translation. The carbon backbone comes from serine, but the selenium donor is selenophosphate, which is made from ATP and selenate.
And the mechanism for actually getting it into the protein, I understand it's like a molecular hack of the genetic code.
It truly is. It uses a very unusual tRNA called tRNA-seq, and it's initially charged with serine. But here's the trick. This tRNA recognizes the UGA codon.
Well, UGA is an S-P codon.
Universally, yes. In every other context, it signals SCOP. To override that signal, the tRNA-seq requires something called a selenocysteine insertion element. It's a specific, complex stem loop structure in the mRNA's untranslated region. Only when that structure is present does the ribosome insert selenocysteine instead of just stopping translation.
So what does this all mean? We started with these simple one-step nitrogen swaps, and we've ended with the body actively hijacking a universal stop sign, using this elaborate three-way molecular handshake just to get one special molecule into a protein.
Our deep dive has really shown the tight metabolic control over these pathways. You've got glutamate, glutamine, and proline coming from alpha-ketoglutarate.
Aspartate and asparagine from oxaloacetate.
And serine and glycine from 3-phosphoglycerate, simple central precursors.
And we reiterated those key dependencies. Cysteine needing methionine for its sulfur, and tyrosine needing phenylalanine. The efficiency of these short pathways is why we can still make these 12 amino acids ourselves.
And we established that profound clinical link between vitamin C and scurvy, showing how a failure in a post-translational modification can compromise the entire structure of the body's most abundant protein.
The spectrum of biochemistry here, from a molecule that spontaneously folds on its own to this incredible stop codon hijacking, it just shows how highly optimized human metabolism really is.
Indeed. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, just reflect on that selenocysteine mechanism for a moment. It's a dedicated, intricate system that hijacks a universal stop codon. This really raises a fascinating question. What other unknown co-translational modifications, maybe regulated by subtle shifts in tRNA availability or mRNA structure, might be impacting human health that we haven't even fully mapped yet?
That's a great question.
The fact that the genetic code can be overridden in such a specific way suggests there might be more surprises hidden in our genetic instructions.
A great thought to leave with, considering how finely tuned our metabolism is and how much we still have to discover. Thank you for allowing us to deep dive into your source material.